Now, there's an ethical issue that I think most of us would agree was wrong, and many of us might agree and say it was the right thing to do, even though it was wrong. I'm going to read this about the Special Bombing Mission number 13. When the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, the plane crew were silent, and Captain Lewis uttered 6 words, "My God, what have we done?" 3 days later, another bomb fell in Nagasaki. About 152,000 Japanese citizens were killed. Many times more were wounded and burned to die later. The next day, Japan sued for peace. When deciding whether or not to use the most terrible weapon ever known to mankind, the U.S. President Harry Truman appointed an interim committee made up of distinguished and responsible people in the government. Most, but not all, of its military advisors favored using the bomb. Top-level scientists said they could find no acceptable alternative to using it. But they were opposed by equally able scientists. Well, after lengthy discussions, the committee decided that the lives saved by ending the war swiftly by using this weapon outweighed the lives destroyed by using it, and thought using the bomb to be the best course of action. What I want to know is, could you have dropped the atomic bomb on one of those Japanese cities? I've changed my mind about this. Back in the fall of 1994, for 4.5 months, the organization I directed had as a visiting guest an hibakusha. Hibakushas are people who survived the atomic bomb blast. Miyoko had survived the atomic bomb blast, being in the river in Hiroshima when the bomb went off. She could describe it very adequately. I had her make presentations anywhere from Princeton University to the Minnesota Public State radio station. She made presentations all over. Not angry. But she didn't want this to happen again. And she wanted people to hear her story. I used to just automatically, because of the way I was brought up in a pacifist church, in a pacifist family, in a pacifist neighborhood, think that dropping the atomic bomb was wrong. The choice to kill people is wrong. Well, when there's a fire, you put it out. When you have a war, you have to stop it. Very rarely do fires just go out by themselves before everything's burned. And very rarely do battles just fizz out unless one side is completely destroyed. Well, in Japan, they have a religion which does not have a god. It's Buddhism. And in Buddhism, there are 4 truths. There is suffering, there is cause for suffering, there is cessation of suffering, it stops, and there is a path leading to the cessation of suffering. In Japan, a Buddhist nation, if they didn't have a god but they believed in suffering, and the emperor told them, you have to fight to the last man, in essence, he became their god. And they would fight to the last man because their emperor told them to do so. No question about it. Now, U.S. military historians and military strategy experts have predicted that, quite possibly, 100,000, to 250,000 U.S. military men and 500,000 to 1 million Japanese military men and civilians would have been killed if the U.S. had gone island to island across the Pacific, invaded Japan, and fought to the last man. That's a potential of close 1.6 to 1.75 million people being killed in fighting. So on one hand, you look back on history and you evaluate it based on what we know. 600 to 750,000 U.S. military men, 100 to 250,000 U.S. military men may have been killed if the fighting continued, and 500,000 to 1.25 million Japanese citizens and soldiers would have been killed. Once a fire starts, you put out the fire. The Allies had been fighting this war for more than 4 years against Germany, which had been defeated earlier in 1945, and now trying to finish up the war against Japan. The likelihood of political leaders, after all that time, figuring out how to stop the war without one side or the other completely losing, seemed about 0%. So the choice became to drop the bomb, which we now know killed 145,000 people in the spot, and 1,000 more since because of radiation poisoning. But invading Japan, with the emperor in essence as God in charge, would have killed at least 800,000 people, Americans and Japanese. So what was the best alternative? What was the best alternative? Going on to another topic. In 2000, there were 1.2 million senior citizens living together who weren't married. In the year 2010, there were 2.75 million senior citizens living together who weren't married. And in 2020, there are more than 4 million senior citizens living together who aren't married. Why? Well, I'm going to tell you a story. I pastored a small church in central Maryland that was located near the Potomac River. Most of the people, most of the families in that church had anywhere from 6, 8, 10, 12 kids. They got their food when they were growing up from the Potomac River, from the woods, and from the fields. They didn't go to grocery stores. They were friends, the people in this church I pastored. They had been friends for decades, through their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and even into their 80s. These people were friends. Now, the person who was pastor at this church before I went there had a wife who became grievously ill. And the pastor and his wife did not have the resources to pay for her medical care. So what's the option in this country? Well, in this country, you can go on Medicaid, not Medicare, but Medicaid, but only if you lower the quantity of all your resources down to the point where, when my in-laws passed away about 10 years ago, they could only have $2,000 in their checking account before they could go on Medicaid and have the government pay for their time in a rest home. So they had to take what minimal income they had and take it down to poverty level. So this pastor had a problem. He couldn't pay for his wife's health care. He wasn't eligible for Medicaid. So he and his wife talked it out and they decided to get a divorce. And they got a divorce. Because now the wife could live at a retirement home, be taken care of, have all the food she needed, get medical care, and she would be taken care of. And the husband, with his meager resources and Social Security, could continue to live by himself in the fairly simple way that he was used to living. Now, this didn't go over well with people in the church. But what would you do if you had to either become paupers in order to get medical care, or divorce so that one of you got medical care and food and a good place to live in while you could survive? What would you do? Those are the ethical issues of this Monday.